Drive was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet you only notice after years of listening for trouble. No gunfire, no broken glass, no shouting across the street, just the steady sigh of the wind through the pines up on the ridge, carrying the dry smell of bark and rust down into town. I'd learned to trust that kind of quiet. It meant trouble hadn't started yet, but it was close enough to taste. I stood outside the saloon with one boot on the step, leaning like I had nowhere better to be, hat brim low, coat open. Folks thought that meant I was relaxed, but the truth was I'd never been relaxed since Shiloh. My leg ached when I stood too long. My hands stayed restless even when they were still. I never liked the badge, never wore it like it fit. 9 years sheriff, 9 years dry, and all I ever did was keep things from splitting open worse than they had to. I didn't bark orders, I didn't swing my fists unless I had no other choice. I just showed up when nobody else wanted to. That afternoon, I felt it in my gut that showing up was about to cost me something. Jed Callahan was standing in the middle of the street, red-faced, grinning through broken teeth, drunk enough to think he was clever. I'd known men like him all my life, loud, useless, eating themselves alive one bottle at a time. His wife stood in front of him, May. I'd seen her before, only in passing. Hard to forget strawberry blonde hair gone dull with dust, shoulders set straight, though her dress hung torn and sweat-stained, barefoot in the dirt. She didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't look at anybody. That silence of hers said more than a scream would have. Jed had a mare on a rope, young and well-fed, probably stolen off some range south of here. He swung the reins like he was dangling gold. "I'll take the damn horse," he slurred, voice carrying down the street. "You get the girl. Fair trade." He laughed like it was a fine joke, like anybody ought to be impressed. Nobody laughed. A couple of men stepped out of the general store, watching from the porch. A boy leaned around the chapel fence, wide-eyed. Even the drunk behind the jailhouse tarp lifted his head to see. No one said a word. That was the part that cut deep. Silence in a town like this could weigh heavier than bullets. I kept my eyes on May. She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink down. Her jaw was tight, her gaze fixed on the shadow under the horse's belly, like it was the only place she could rest her eyes. I knew that look. I'd worn it myself once, waiting for somebody else to decide whether I lived or died. She looked like a woman who had already stopped hoping, but hadn't learned how to bow her head. That meant something. Jed chuckled again, drunker by the second. "Hell, I'll throw in the saddle if you throw in a bottle." He thought he was winning, thought she was already lost. I stepped down from the saloon step, didn't say a word. My boot hit the dirt, soft, steady, not fast. I walked. Across the street, not toward Jed, not toward May, just straight past them to the rail where my stallion was tied. Black coat, steady eyes, best horse I'd ever kept. I untied the reins and led him toward the mare. Jed blinked, then barked a laugh. "You serious?" I didn't answer. Didn't need to. I just held out the stallion's reins, traded for the mare's rope. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I stayed square, not angry, not smiling, just tired and certain. Jed's grin wavered, but he spat in the dirt and swung into the saddle. "She ain't no prize, Sheriff," he muttered as he rode out, "but suit yourself." I didn't watch him go. I listened to the sound of hooves fade against the ridge until it was gone. Then I turned. May still hadn't moved. Sweat ran down her neck, her chest rising sharp like she couldn't take a full breath. I knew that feeling too, waiting for the next blow, the next order, the next man to decide what you're worth. "You got a name?" I asked. My voice came low even. She looked at me for the first time, just a second, but long enough for me to see she wasn't expecting pity and sure as hell didn't want it. She nodded once. "May," she said, voice rough from not being used. "That's fine," I said. I turned toward the end of the street, toward my place. Didn't tell her to follow. Didn't tell her not to. Just walked. I heard her steps fall in behind me, slow and stiff, like she hadn't decided yet if she was leaving or just too empty to turn back. Nobody in town stopped her. Nobody called her name. The boy at the chapel fence ducked away. The men on the porch looked down at their boots. The town had made its choice when it kept silent, and I'd made mine when I opened my mouth. I don't know if you ever had a moment where you knew nothing would be the same after. For me, it was the sound of her bare feet in the dust, trailing me out of town. I'd gone into that day thinking I was just keeping peace. I walked out knowing I'd carried someone's life into my own hands, and maybe you can feel it too, hearing it now. If you've walked with me this far, I ask you to keep walking. These stories, they live better when they're shared. So if this start pulled at you, hit that like button, leave a comment. Tell me if you'd have traded your horse in my place, and don't forget to subscribe so you can hear the rest of what happened after I took May Callahan away from that dust-choked street. There's more to tell, and I reckon you'll want to stay. The road out past the chapel felt longer that day. My leg dragged the way it always did after too much standing, but I didn't pay it much mind. What I noticed was the sound of her steps behind me, bare feet in the dust, light but uneven, like she wanted to keep space between us. I didn't look back. Some things you don't force. If she was coming, it had to be because she chose to, even if it was only for lack of anywhere else to stand. My place isn't much to look at. Folks pass it by without thinking. A plain wood frame house leaning a little toward the slope, 2 chairs on the porch, a fence I hadn't bothered to fix, and a chicken coop that hadn't held hens in weeks. My mutt lay under the porch as usual, white paws stretched out, ears twitching, though he never barked at anyone. It wasn't a home meant for company. I hadn't thought of it as home at all since the winter of '68, when fever took my wife and daughter. It was just shelter. A roof and 4 walls to keep me dry. That afternoon, though, I saw it through her eyes, the sagging rail, the empty yard, the silence hanging heavy around the windows. I wondered if it looked like safety to her, or just another place to be trapped. I opened the front door and stepped aside. Didn't touch her, didn't tell her to move, just nodded once. "You can come in if you want." She hesitated a moment, then walked through. Her shoulders stiff, her arms held close to her sides like she didn't know where to put them. The house was plain. Table, 2 chairs, a stove, a cot near the back wall already made. An old photograph hung over the mantel, blurred by dust. She didn't ask who it was, and I didn't tell her. I motioned to the cot. "That's yours." She sat just on the edge of it, fingers trembling in her lap. I could see the fight in her. Part of her wanting to bolt, part of her too worn down to move. I didn't ask anything. Not where she came from, not what Jed had done, not what she planned to do next. None of that mattered right then. She needed air that wasn't thick with judgment. She needed a door that didn't slam behind her. So I left her there and stepped back outside, sat on the porch with the dog at my feet. The air smelled like pine smoke, the sun slipping low over the ridge. I let the silence sit. Inside, I knew she wasn't crying. I could feel it. She was too far past that. Sometimes pain runs dry, leaves only stone behind. I understood that. I'd lived it. When the sun went down, I made beans and bread. Nothing special, just what I had. Set a plate down for her without saying a word. She didn't eat, didn't even look at it. I didn't press. Hunger has its own time. That night, I left the door unlocked. Wind rattled the shutters, whistled through the cracks in the walls. She kept her boots by the door, ready to run if she had to. I saw it and let it be. Trust isn't something you buy or ask for. It's something you wait on. I didn't sleep much, but I never did. My nights were long, filled with the sound of Shiloh still ringing in my bones, filled with the memory of a small voice calling Pa that I'd never hear again. I reckoned her night was longer. I heard the cot creak once or twice, heard her breathing shallow, always ready for footsteps that never came. She wasn't used to silence without violence under it. Morning came pale and cold. Frost edged the window panes. A draft slid under the door. I stoked the stove and set water to boil. When I came back with a folded cloth and a tin cup, I placed it on the table by the door. She hadn't heard me come in. I saw it bother her, that I could move quiet. I understood that too. When you've lived with someone who stormed in loud quiet, can feel just as dangerous. She stepped out a little later, dress pulled straighter, tie tightened at her waist. She looked smaller in daylight, not weaker, just worn thin. I handed her a tin cup. "I made coffee, ain't strong." She nodded, didn't speak. Her hands shook when she lifted it, but she drank. "You can stay as long as you need," I said. "That's up to you." Her eyes came up quick, searching for the catch, the part where I'd tell her what she owed, what price I'd paid. I saw the question in her face before she asked it. "I don't want charity," she said. "Not offering it," I told her. "Place runs better with more hands. You do what you want. No one's keeping score." Her shoulders dropped a little then, not much, just enough for me to see the weight shift. She nodded once. That was enough. I went out to the south field to check the fence. My leg pulled at me, stiff from the cold. From the corner of my eye, I saw her standing in the doorway, watching. She didn't step out, but she didn't hide either. That was something. Later, when I came back from the well, the porch was swept clean. Dust pushed off the steps. Broom leaned against the wall. She didn't say she'd done it, but I knew. I gave her a small nod as I passed. Didn't need more than that. That night, she ate the stew I set down. Not all of it, but enough. I didn't watch her, didn't ask her why. When she finally spoke, her voice came out low. Why did you do it? I looked up from where I was oiling the hinge on the front door. Do what? Trade your horse for me. I set the oil tin down, thought a long moment. Didn't feel like watching him ride off with both. She stared at me, eyes unreadable, then dropped her gaze. Maybe it wasn't the answer she expected, but it was the truth. I wasn't in the business of saving anyone. I just couldn't stomach being part of the crowd that let it happen. Later, after she'd gone to bed, I sat by the fire a while longer. The house was quiet, but not heavy. It felt different, like something had shifted just enough to make room. I watched the flames curl low and thought about how a man can live half dead without even noticing until someone else steps inside his silence. The first days with May in my house were made of silence, the kind that carried weight but not threat. I'd lived alone long enough to know the difference. Silence can be sharp, like a blade waiting to fall, or it can just be a hollow room echoing with nothing. Hers was neither. Hers was tight, guarded, like she was standing on the edge of a creek and waiting to see if the water would rise or recede. She didn't sleep much. I could hear her cot shift at night, hear her breathing catch every time the wind pushed against the shutters. I knew those sounds well. You don't rest easy when the past still keeps its hand around your throat. My own nights were never quiet either. Shiloh never let go of me. Even years later, I'd still wake with my hand on the floor beside me, like I was searching for a rifle that wasn't there. The difference between us was I'd grown used to it. She hadn't. She was still learning how to survive it. In the mornings, I stoked the stove, made coffee, and put it on the table before she came out. Her steps were slow, cautious, like she was walking into someone else's life and afraid to set anything out of place. She'd nod, pick up the tin cup, and sit without speaking. I didn't press her. Words don't come easy when you've been taught they'll be used against you. I figured she'd speak when she needed to, and until then, the quiet between us wasn't a burden. I noticed the way her hands shook less with each day. The first morning, she could barely keep the coffee from spilling. By the third, her grip was steadier, her shoulders not so rigid. She still kept her boots by the door, though. Every time she passed them, I saw her eyes flick down quick, as if to remind herself she could still leave if she had to. I let it be. A person has to know they can walk out before they ever decide to stay. I kept myself busy with what needed doing. Fence lines sagged in the south field, tools needed oiling, wood needed splitting. My limp slowed me down, but steady work keeps a man from sinking too far inside his own head. I'd glance back at the house sometimes and see her standing in the doorway, arms folded tight, watching. Not in suspicion, more like she was taking measure of the place, learning its corners. By the second afternoon, I came back to find the porch swept clean. Dust brushed away, steps cleared, broom leaned against the wall. I didn't ask her about it, just gave a small nod when I passed. That was enough. She started doing little things after that, straightened the tablecloth I'd never noticed was crooked, scrubbed the floor on her knees until her fingers were raw, folded the blankets tighter than I ever had. None of it because I told her to. She was making space less foreign, less like she was borrowing it. I understood that. When my wife was alive, she kept this house stitched together with small touches. After I lost her and Anna, I stopped seeing those details. The curtains frayed, the chair legs stayed loose, the shelves leaned. A man alone doesn't fix things that don't break. But watching May bend over the floorboards, sweeping dust out of corners, I realized she wasn't just cleaning. She was testing the walls, seeing if they would hold her weight. At night, I cooked. Nothing more than beans, stew, cornbread when I had flour. I'd set a plate down for her, not looking too long, not waiting for thanks. The first night she didn't eat at all. The second, she picked at it. The third, She ate steady, spoon scraping soft against the bowl. That sound meant more to me than any words she could have said. It meant she trusted enough to let hunger show. One evening, as the fire burned low, she asked, "Why did you do it?" I was oiling the hinge on the front door, rag in hand, smell of iron and grease mixing with smoke. I looked up. "Do what?" "Trade your horse for me." I paused, set the tin down. I hadn't thought about it since. "Didn't feel like watching him ride off with both," I said. She studied me a long moment, then dropped her gaze back to her lap. Maybe she expected more, maybe less, but it was the only truth I had. I hadn't saved her, I just couldn't stomach being one more man standing still while she was handed off like a sack of grain. When I stepped outside after that, the dog came up beside me, his fur brushing my leg, and I sat with the night air heavy on my shoulders. The house behind me didn't sound so empty anymore. For years, I'd listened to nothing but my own footsteps, my own breath, the creak of wood. Now there was another sound in it, soft movements, measured breaths, the stir of someone trying not to disturb too much. The silence wasn't heavy now. It wasn't sharp. It was just waiting, stretching itself out, making room for something neither of us had named yet. And I realized then that I didn't mind the waiting, not one bit. I'd lived long enough in Dry Vale to know how people watched without saying much. A man can feel eyes on his back before he ever hears the words. When May stepped into town with me for the first time, that weight was thick in the air. I'd told her she didn't need to come, but she'd squared her shoulders, tied her shawl close, and climbed onto the mare like she meant to ride through fire if she had to. She didn't say it, but I knew what it cost her to sit straight in that saddle, chin up, when half the town still remembered the way Jed left her standing barefoot in the dust. The street went quieter than usual when we came in. It always did when folks smelled something worth talking about. Men leaned on porch posts, women slowed their steps, conversations dipped low but never far enough to disappear. I'd felt that quiet before, too. It was the same one I'd heard after Shiloh, when men whispered over the wounded, deciding which ones might see morning and which ones they'd best stop looking at. May knew that silence, too. I saw her eyes flick once to the side, then settle straight ahead, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her falter. We tied up outside Rowley's store. I pushed the door open, bell ringing sharp in the stillness, and stepped aside so she could walk in first. She hesitated only a breath, then moved past me. Inside smelled of tobacco and flour dust, shelves stacked with nails, kerosene tins, bolts of cloth, jars of penny candy. May kept her hands folded tight around the basket she carried, eyes on the shelves, every muscle in her body strung like wire. Agnes Rowley stood behind the counter, ledger open, her two boys stacking sacks in the back. She glanced up, her mouth pressing thin before she even said a word. Agnes had a way of looking that weighed a person like grain on a scale. She studied May a moment, then leaned forward, her voice flat but not loud. "You're Jed's, aren't you?" The words hung there, sharp as a shot. May froze, shoulders stiffening like she'd been struck. For a moment, I thought she might crumble under it, but she didn't speak, just stared at the wooden floor, jaw tight enough to crack. I stepped forward before the silence stretched too long. My voice came steady, even, no more than what needed saying. Number. She's not. That was all. I didn't raise my voice, didn't reach for my badge, didn't put a hand on my gun. Just spoke the truth, plain and final. But it landed like a gavel. The room went still, the kind of still that told me Agnes had heard more than she expected. Her eyes shifted from me to May, then back again. She gave a short nod, said nothing more, and went back to wrapping the flour sack in brown paper. I felt May's eyes on me then, quick and searching. Not long, but enough. She didn't ask me later why I'd said it. She didn't need to. I'd seen the way her breath caught, the way her shoulders eased just a fraction. Sometimes the smallest words mean more than any speech. We gathered our things, nails, tobacco, flour, thread she'd chosen herself, and stepped back out into the street. Sunlight hit her hair, caught the strawberry blonde under the dust. She blinked hard against it, but she didn't lower her head. Folks were still watching, but she met their eyes now, one by one, not daring them, not pleading, just letting them see she wasn't hidden anymore. We mounted up, the mare shifting under her but settling once she had the reins. I kept a few paces ahead on the gelding I'd borrowed, letting her ride her own horse, her own way. Halfway down the street, I glanced back. She sat taller than when we'd come in, jaw still clenched but steady. On the way home, the road stretched quiet between us. I could hear the jingle of tack, the creak of leather, her breath slower now that the town was behind us. She didn't speak until we were near the ridge. Her voice was low, almost swallowed by the wind. "Why'd you say that?" I kept my eyes on the path. "Because it's true." She didn't answer right away, but when I looked over, I saw her swallow hard, the knot in her throat easing just slightly. That was the first time I thought maybe she'd start to believe it herself one day, that she wasn't anyone's to trade, to claim, to name. That night, after we'd unloaded supplies and supper was on the stove, I sat on the porch listening to the wind cut down off the ridge. She was inside, folding the new packet of thread, setting it on the shelf beside the tea she'd picked. I could hear the small movements, careful, deliberate, like she was arranging pieces of a life that might finally belong to her. I thought about the way folks had looked at her, the way Agnes's words had landed. I thought about how May had stood through it, silent but unbroken. And I thought about my own answer, those 3 words I'd said without hesitation. No, she's not. It wasn't some grand declaration. It was just the truth. But truth has a way of cutting cleaner than any lie, and I reckon she'd needed to hear it spoken out loud, maybe more than she'd admit. The town would keep watching. I knew that. Gossip doesn't die easy in places like this, but I also knew one thing with certainty. She wasn't Jed's. She wasn't property. She was May. And as long as she walked beside me, that was how it was going to stay. You can tell the kind of man a cousin is by the way he carries another man's sins. Luke Harlan was Jed's kin, younger, but cut from the same rotten cloth. And when he came into Rowley's store that morning, I knew it wasn't salt or flour he wanted. He came for the same reason Jed always did, to make sure somebody else bore the weight of his own emptiness. May had walked in ahead of me, basket in her arms, her shawl tied neat across her shoulders. She'd been holding herself straighter these last few days, not lighter yet, but steadier. The sound of her boots on the plank floor was even, not hurried. She was learning how to walk in a room without shrinking. I was proud of that in a quiet way I didn't put into words. Agnes was counting coins behind the counter, and I was setting down a coil of rope when Luke's voice cut through the air. It had that greasy tone, half grin, half threat. Funny what a badge lets a man get away with these days. May stiffened, basket handle creaking under her grip. She turned slow, her face pale but her eyes set forward. I saw the heat rise in her throat, though she said nothing. She'd been through too much to give him the reaction he wanted. Luke leaned against a barrel of oats, arms crossed, mouth curled like a dog showing teeth. "Man trades a horse for a woman," he said, voice louder now so the whole store could hear. "Now he's got her cooking biscuits and sleeping under his roof. Town don't say a word." The words landed heavy. Agnes stiffened, her boys paused mid-step, eyes wide. May didn't move. She held her ground, shoulders locked, but I knew what it cost her to stand there, to keep her chin level. I stepped in then, slow and steady, my hand setting the rope down on the counter like I wasn't in any hurry. "You done talking?" My voice wasn't raised, just enough to carry. Luke shifted, his grin faltering for the briefest moment. "Just saying what folks are already thinking." I nodded once. "Then go ahead and say it to me." That's all it took. I didn't lean forward, didn't reach for my gun, didn't so much as twitch, but I squared myself. Weight even, shoulders set, and in that silence he saw the line drawn. Men like Luke, they live off weakness, they feed on it. But when they look into something that doesn't bend, they turn sour quick. Luke shifted his weight, eyes flicking between me and May. His smirk cracked. He muttered something under his breath and pushed off the barrel, heading for the door. The bell clanged sharp when it shut behind him, and just like that, the air seemed to release. I didn't look at May right away. I counted out coins, slid them across the counter, picked up the rope. My hands were steady, though my blood was hot. Not with fear, not even anger, but with the knowledge that no matter how many fences I mended or shutters I patched, there'd always be men like Luke trying to tear holes in what little piece I could offer her. When I finally turned, May's jaw was tight, her eyes burning, not with tears, but with something sharper. Shame, maybe. or the memory of being treated like stock. She kept her gaze on the floor until we were halfway down the street. Then, her voice came low, almost swallowed by the sound of the wind. He wasn't wrong. I stopped walking. My shadow stretched long beside hers on the dirt road, both of us standing still in the glare of noon. She kept her eyes down, her fingers twisting at the edge of her shawl. "That's how it started," she said, voice cracking just a little. I took a step closer, my voice calm but clear. "That ain't what it is." She looked up then, eyes searching mine, demanding something more. "Then what is it?" I held her gaze a long moment, steady as I could, letting her see I wasn't backing away from the truth of it. "Something else." I didn't explain further. Sometimes words only make things smaller. Sometimes it's enough to say what it isn't and let time do the rest. That night, she sat on the porch wrapped in her shawl, knees drawn up, eyes on the ridge as the dark settled in. I joined her, not in the chair, just on the step beside her, close enough for her to feel I was there, far enough that she didn't feel pressed. I handed her a tin cup of tea. She didn't look at me, just took it, fingers brushing mine for a second before curling around the warm metal. After a long while, I spoke. "You don't owe me anything." She stared ahead, voice low but certain. "I know." I nodded. "But I'll stand with you, if it gets worse." Her throat tightened, breath catching against the night air. She swallowed hard, then said quietly, "I won't run." "I know," I answered, and I believed it. We sat there until the wind lifted the corner of the doormat and the stars came out sharp over the ridge. No more words, just the silence that wasn't heavy anymore, the silence of two people who had stood through a storm together and were still sitting side by side. The days that followed fell into a rhythm I hadn't known I was missing. It wasn't quick or loud or filled with talk. It was quiet, steady, the kind of rhythm you only notice when you've been living too long without it. Morning started with the smell of coffee, her steps soft against the floorboards, the dog stretching at the door, and me listening to the house sound different than it had in years. May had stopped standing in the doorway like she was half in and half out. Now she moved through the rooms like she was learning their weight, as if each corner had to prove itself solid before she gave it her trust. She kept her hands busy, and I let her. She swept, mended, scrubbed, stitched. Not because I asked, but because she couldn't sit still with silence pressing in. I understood that. Work steadies a person when memory won't let them rest. One morning, I came in from splitting wood and found her at the table stitching the hem of my old winter coat. She had thread pinched tight, her head bent, hair falling loose at her temple. She didn't ask if she could, just did it. I stood there a moment, watching the way her hands moved, small but certain, before I cleared my throat so she'd know I was there. She glanced up quick, eyes flashing like she'd been caught stealing, but I only said, "That coat's seen better days." Her mouth twitched, almost a smile, though it faded fast. "Seams were tearing," she said. I nodded. Good eye. She went back to her stitching, shoulders not so stiff now. That's how it was between us. Little things said plain, nothing pressed too hard, enough to let her know she wasn't invisible, and I knew what she was offering. The chicken coop had been leaning half collapsed since last winter. I hadn't bothered fixing it, not with no hens to feed, but one afternoon she stood beside me in the yard, arms crossed, looking at it the way a woman looks at something she's already decided about. "I want to fix the coop," she said. I didn't ask why, just nodded and handed her the hammer. We worked side by side that day. I held boards in place, she drove nails, hands trembling at first, but steadying as the hours passed. We patched holes with feed sacks, hammered tin along the roof, moved slow but sure. I felt something loosen inside me watching her. Not because the coop mattered, it didn't, but because she did. She was laying claim to a place that had only ever felt empty. When we finished, I stepped back and nodded. "You did most of that." She wiped her brow with her sleeve, looked at the slanted roof. "Still needs paint." I let out a small grin, just the corner of my mouth. "Chickens won't care." She glanced at me, eyes brighter than I'd seen. "Maybe I do." It was the first time she'd spoken with that kind of firmness, not sharp, not fearful, just hers. I memorized the sound of it. That night, she pulled a bundle of red cloth from the corner of her cot and sat by the fire, stitching pieces together. She didn't explain, and I didn't ask, but I knew. She was making a quilt, not for warmth only, but for staying. Her hands worked slow, needle catching the light, and I sat nearby, fixing the pantry hinge. At one point, I hit my thumb with the hammer and swore under my breath. She startled, then to my surprise, laughed. It wasn't loud, not long, but it was real. She clapped her hand to her mouth quick like it had slipped out by mistake. Her eyes went wide, waiting for me to turn it into something it wasn't. I didn't. I just looked at her a moment and said, "Don't stop." She blinked, unsure if I meant the quilt or the laugh, but I didn't clarify. Truth was, I meant both. That night, she left her door half open for the first time. I noticed it when I walked past after stoking the fire. The light from the coals flickered across her face where she lay on the cot, her breathing even, not shallow like before. For the first time since she'd stepped into my house, she looked less like someone braced to run and more like someone letting herself rest. Each day after, the rhythm deepened. She'd wake not from panic but from the smell of coffee. I'd find the broom leaned neat by the door after she'd swept. She began moving in ways that weren't about survival anymore, but about belonging, pulling curtains tight against the frost, setting flour tins in order, sewing patches on clothes without being asked. I'd been a man who lived half dead for years, just fixing what broke and letting the rest stay undone. But with her, the house began to feel different. Not mine alone. Ours, though neither of us said it. One evening, after we ate stew together in the quiet, I watched her fold her thread back into its bundle and lay it on the shelf. Her fingers lingered there like she was placing more than thread down. She looked up and caught me watching. For a second, she didn't flinch, didn't look away. That's when I knew trust wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned in small pieces, with steady hands and silence that gave space instead of fear. And for the first time in years, I felt the kind of quiet a man can live inside. I always knew Jed Callahan wasn't finished. Men like him don't ride off into the pines and disappear. They circle back, like wolves, too mean and too proud to accept they've lost their meal. Still, when I saw him step out of the trees that cold gray afternoon, I felt a weight drop in my chest. I'd been waiting for it, but waiting doesn't make the moment easier. May was on the mare, riding back from town with a basket tied across the saddle horn. I'd heard the hoofbeats first, steady, then break short. I stepped out of the shed, wiping my hands on a rag, and saw her stop in the road. Jed stood a few yards ahead, coat hanging loose, face gaunt from drink, eyes sunken like he hadn't slept in weeks. He had no horse, no pride left in the way he carried himself, only that sneer that tried to pretend he still held power. "Well," he said, spitting to the side, "ain't this a sight?" May didn't answer. Her grip on the reins tightened, her back straight. She didn't turn the mare, didn't flee, though I could see her heart pounding in the pulse at her throat. She said only one word, clear and flat as iron. "Sheriff." I was already walking, my coat open, my limp steady, my hand resting loose at my side. I didn't reach for the gun, didn't need to. Jed turned when he saw me, his sneer faltering just enough to show he hadn't expected me so quick. "You need to leave," I said. My voice was calm, no louder than it needed to be. Jed scoffed, looking between us, searching for footing he no longer had. "I come for what's mine. Ain't right. A man trades a horse and loses both." May's voice cut him off before I could. "I'm not yours." Her words landed flat, certain. She didn't shout, didn't waver. She looked straight at him, not down, not away. Jed blinked like he didn't know what to do with the truth said plain. His mouth worked, but nothing came. He stepped closer, too close, eyes darting between her and me. That's when I stopped walking, stopped just a few feet away and squared myself. "You're not welcome here," I told him. "You come back again, I won't be talking first." The silence stretched long between us. I let him see it wasn't anger in me. Anger can be broken, baited. What I carried was certainty. He knew it. His eyes flickered, his shoulders sagged, and the sneer dropped clean off his face. "Figures," he muttered, voice bitter as bile. "She fits better with a broken man, anyhow." He turned then, stumbling back toward the trees, coat flapping open, no horse to carry him, no weight left in his words. The forest swallowed him slow until he was gone. May slid down from the saddle. Her hands were steady now, though her breath came hard. She didn't cry, didn't shake. She just looked at me, her eyes fierce but searching. "You all right?" I asked. She nodded once, then after a pause said, "I didn't run." I felt something shift in me then, quiet but deep. I gave her the same nod back. "Number you didn't." That night, the fire burned low, and the air inside the house felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but settled in a way I hadn't known before. May pulled the quilt she'd been stitching across both chairs in front of the stove, her fingers smoothing the fabric like it was more than cloth, like it was proof of something. She poured tea without asking if I wanted it, set it in front of me, then sat down close enough that I could hear the steadiness in her breath. I tightened the legs on her chair, ones that had been loose for years, and she watched me work. We didn't speak of Jed again. We didn't have to. The silence between us wasn't about fear anymore. It was about choice. For the first time since she'd stepped into my house, I knew the past couldn't drag her back. Not while I was standing, not while she was choosing to stay. And as I looked at her across that small table, hands wrapped around her cup, eyes steady in the glow of the fire, I realized something I hadn't let myself feel in years. I wasn't alone anymore. I'd always kept the past folded away in a box under my bed. It wasn't locked, wasn't hidden, just pushed aside where I didn't have to see it. Letters yellowed with time, a photograph blurred from too many hands, a child's ribbon gone brittle with age. I never opened it, couldn't bring myself to. To me, it wasn't a box of keepsakes, it was a grave I carried under my own roof. One evening, I came in from the fields to find May sweeping near the bedroom. She didn't mean to stumble across it. I could tell by the way her eyes darted to me when I saw the box on the floor, lid closed, but shifted from where it had sat for years. She'd put it back exactly how she found it, careful as someone handling glass, but I knew she'd seen enough to know it mattered. I didn't say anything then, just nodded and went about supper, though my chest felt tight as a vice. All through the meal, I caught her glancing at me, like she was waiting for me to close the door she'd accidentally cracked open, but I didn't. Truth was, the air inside me had been pressing for years, and maybe her eyes on that box loosened something. Later, when the dishes were washed and the fire burned low, I sat at the table and pulled the box out. I didn't look at her, didn't make a speech, just set it down and lifted the lid. My hands felt clumsy on the old paper, but I handed one of the letters across to her. "It's from her," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, like I hadn't spoken it in years. "My wife." May's fingers brushed the edge of the page, light as if it might crumble. She unfolded it slow, eyes moving careful over each line. I watched her face, not the letter. I'd memorized those words long ago. What I needed was to see them reflected in someone else's eyes. When she finished, she laid it down soft. "She sounds kind," she said. "She was," I answered, the words coming heavy but steady. "Too kind for what I became after." Her gaze lifted, meeting mine across the table. There was no pity in it, no fear, just quiet understanding. "You're not the man who left that letter unopened," she said. "Not anymore." For a long moment, I couldn't breathe right. My chest felt hollow, my throat raw. I let out a breath I'd been holding for years, one I didn't even know I'd kept trapped. My hand rested on the edge of the box, not to close it, but to steady myself. I told her then, words I'd never said to another soul. Her name was Clara. Our daughter's name was Anna. Fever took them in the winter of '68, fast, brutal. I sat helpless while the house went quiet around me. I buried them both under the ridge. My voice caught, but I forced myself on. After that, I stopped speaking their names, not because I forgot, because I didn't think I deserved to. The fire cracked low. May sat still, her hands folded around the edge of the table, eyes glinting. In the firelight, she didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch, let me carry it out into the open without trying to sew it up too quick. "You do," she said finally, her voice low but sure. "You still do." The simplicity of it cut through me sharper than anything else could have. No long speech, no soft words to soften the edges, just the truth. I leaned back, let the chair creak under me, and stared into the flames. For the first time in years, the weight of their names didn't crush me when I carried them in my chest. Instead, it felt like I'd placed them in the open air, where someone else could share the burden. May reached forward then, not to touch the box, but to cover my hand with hers. Her palm was small, rough from work, trembling just slightly. I didn't move. just let her hand sit there, the warmth of it grounding me in a way nothing else had in a long time. We didn't speak more that night. We didn't need to. The box stayed open on the table, its contents spread like pieces of a life I'd once believed was buried too deep to unearth. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to hide it away again. When I finally rose, I placed the letters back inside with care, not to bury them, but to keep them safe. Then I closed the lid, set it on the shelf by the mantel instead of under the bed, a place where it could be seen, not hidden. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, not from the ache of old wounds, but from the quiet peace of having finally spoken them. Through the wall, I could hear May's breathing, slow and steady, no longer sharp with fear. And I thought about how strange it was that a woman traded off like a horse in the street had walked into my silence and handed me back the voices I'd locked away. It struck me then that maybe grief doesn't end when time passes. Maybe it ends when someone else is willing to sit in it with you and say the names out loud without flinching. And for the first time in 9 years, I felt like I wasn't carrying the past alone. When spring started to press against the frost, I noticed the change first in her hands. May didn't work to pass the hours anymore. She worked to build something she wanted to see grow. She cleared the back garden, broke the stiff soil with raw palms, and knelt until her knees ached. Onions first, then beans, then talk of tomatoes once the ground warmed. Every night she came in with dirt under her nails and a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I'd watch her spread the seeds into the furrows, careful and deliberate, and I knew she wasn't planting just food. She was planting her claim, thread by thread, into the earth. One evening, I built her a second shelf near the kitchen window. No one asked me to. I just saw her stacking tins too high, stretching on her toes to reach them. When she noticed, she smiled, small but real, and said, "That's better." She didn't thank me with words, but with the way her hand lingered on the fit wood longer than needed. That was enough. The cabin was different now, too. Curtains on the windows, ones she'd sewn herself. A second chair on the porch, paint chipped but sturdy. She laid a quilt over the bed, not my cot and her cot anymore, but both pulled together, covered by the same cloth she'd pieced through the winter. I'd find her smoothing the folds some mornings, her fingertips brushing the fabric like it held more than stitches. I reckon it did. It held her decision. In town, people's eyes shifted. They didn't stop watching her, but the stares softened. Agnes Rowley gave her a nod once that almost looked like respect. Miriam from the chapel asked if she'd think about helping teach come fall. May told her she'd think on it. I saw the pride in her face even when she tried to hide it. She wasn't a shadow anymore. She was May. One night after supper, she asked me, "Do you ever think of leaving Dry Vale?" I looked at her across the table, the lamplight catching the red of her hair. "Thought about it," I said. "Not lately." "Why not?" she asked. I let the silence sit a long moment before answering. Started fixing things instead. She nodded, eyes on the rim of her cup, but I saw the way her lips curved just slightly, like my answer settled something she hadn't wanted to ask straight. Later that week, while sweeping under my bed, she found the box of letters again. This time, I didn't wait. I opened it beside her, shared the names of the ones I'd lost. Clara, my wife, Anna, our girl. The fever that took them quick left me hollow. I told her I stopped speaking their names because I thought I hadn't earned the right. She told me plain, "You do. You still do." Those words stayed with me longer than any sermon I'd ever heard. That night I built the fire higher than usual, not for warmth, but because I wanted the light to reach every corner. I set the box on the mantel where anyone could see it, not hidden away anymore. May sat by the hearth, sewing a strip of cloth into her quilt, her head bent, her face steady. I looked at her then and realized the house wasn't just mine any longer. It hadn't been for a while. The next morning, she set her boots neatly under the bed instead of by the door. I noticed it but didn't say a word. Sometimes the smallest choices speak the loudest. When the frost broke for good, she bought seed packets in town with her own coin. She carried them in her apron like they were jewels. That night she spread them out on the table, letting me see the labels: tomatoes, beans, carrots. Her voice came quiet but sure. "We'll need steaks for the taller ones." "We." That was the first time she'd said it that way. Not I, not you. "We. I carved stakes the next day, set them by the fence line where she wanted them. She came beside me with a length of twine, tying it off with hands that didn't tremble anymore. The soil was rough under her boots, but she didn't flinch at the blisters. She leaned into the work like she belonged to it. At night, when we sat on the porch, the silence had changed. It wasn't two strangers keeping space. It was two people who knew they didn't have to fill every quiet with words. Sometimes she'd hum low under her breath, and I'd sit listening like it was a sound I'd been missing all my life. I realized then that choosing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the way a quilt covers both beds, or the way boots stay under the frame instead of by the door. It's in the way seeds get pressed into the soil, not to survive the week, but to grow into years. And when she looked at me one evening, dirt still under her nails, hair loose from her tie, and said, "This feels like home," I didn't answer right away. My chest ached too much, in a way that felt more alive than it had in nearly a decade. I finally managed a nod. "Yeah," I said, "it does." That was the night I stopped wondering if she'd run. That was the night I knew she'd chosen to stay. By the time spring laid itself over Dry Vale, the world around us felt different. The soil softened, the creek ran full again, birds filled the ridge with sound. But the change that mattered most wasn't in the land. It was in the house, in the garden, in the quiet ways May and I had learned to belong to the same life. The quilt she finished through the winter now stretched across our bed. Not mine and hers, but ours, pushed together under one cloth stitched by her hands. Some mornings I'd wake before the sun, see her still curled beneath it, hair loose across her face, and I'd think about how far we'd both come. A woman traded in the street, a man half dead from loss, and yet here we were, under the same roof, still choosing each other when the day began. The garden grew steady under her care, rows of onions already green, beans climbing the stakes I carved, tomatoes soon to follow. She kept a small ledger now, folded pages filled with notes about soil and weather, plans for the next planting. I'd find her sitting by the porch with the book on her lap, pencil in hand, chewing her lip as she thought. "We'll need a bigger shelf come fall," she'd say, or, "I want to try pumpkins next year." Every time she said "we," I felt something loosen in me, like the world had righted itself just a little. In town, people's voices had shifted too. They still remembered who she'd been, but now they saw who she was. Agnes Rowley looked her in the eye when she passed, not down her nose. Miriam from the chapel asked if she'd help teach the little ones. The mayor himself stopped me once on the main street, hands in his pockets, voice quiet. "Council wants to know if you'll keep the badge another year," he said. I looked at May before I answered. "Yeah," I told him, "I'll keep it." Because for the first time in 9 years, the town felt worth protecting. Jed never came back. His absence was a kind of shadow at first, like we kept expecting him to appear in the tree line. But weeks passed, then months, and the shadow thinned. May stopped checking the door before bed. She stopped leaving her boots by the threshold. She smoothed her quilt at night and laid her sewing kit on the shelf without glancing toward escape. One evening she looked at me and said, "I chose to stay." I didn't need to answer. She already knew I'd chosen her the moment I stepped off that saloon step. I'd lost a wife and a daughter to fever years before. For the longest time, I believed that meant my life had ended too, even if I kept walking through it. But May taught me something I hadn't expected to learn again, that grief doesn't mean you stop living. It just waits for you to find another reason to breathe. She became that reason, not because she needed saving, but because she stood with me in the silence and let me remember I wasn't done yet. One morning, I found her standing by the fence, hands folded across her apron, her thumbs resting against her belly in a way that told me before her words did. She looked at me, eyes steady, and I understood. I laid a hand on her shoulder, no grand words, just the quiet certainty that we were about to carry new life together. Later that day, I found myself patching the shed roof, making sure the boards held tight. I wanted everything to stand strong. When I sat on the porch at dusk, watching her sew curtains for the bedroom, I thought about how life can turn when you least expect it. A woman meant to be traded like cattle, a man who thought his heart was buried under the ridge, and together we'd built something simple, honest, ours. I learned that love doesn't always arrive with fire and thunder. Sometimes it's just a quilt laid over 2 chairs, a seed pressed into the soil, a laugh shared when you least expect it. I don't claim we were healed all at once. Wounds stay, scars stay, memories stay, but we found a way to carry them together instead of alone. And that, more than anything, made this cabin a home again. Now, if you've walked this whole road with me, you've heard more than just my story. You've heard what it means to keep showing up when the world tells you to turn away. You've heard what it means to trade something precious, not because you're a savior, but because you can't stand to be part of the silence. And maybe you've heard what I learned, that the best things we carry are the ones we choose, day after day, even when it's hard. If any of this stayed with you, if you felt even a piece of what I've carried, I'd ask you to do one thing for me. Leave a comment, tell me what you saw in May's courage or in the quiet ways we built this life. Press that like button so others can find their way to this story. And if you want to walk further with me, follow this channel. Because there's more to tell, more lessons tucked in the corners of silence, more proof that even in a place like Dry Vale, hope can take root again. I'll leave you. With this, she chose to stay. And sometimes that's the bravest thing any of us can do.